Hello everyone! Regardless of where you teach, you will encounter many manifestations of student diversity in your classroom. The goal of this chapter is to help you build a framework to better understand the many sources of diversity in the classroom and to develop an open mind when interpreting students' thinking and behavior. Expert teachers know that students differ in many fundamental ways that affect how they learn. Effective teachers will adapt their teaching to reach every student. Each one of your students will have an identity that is product of his or her past experiences, abilities, personality, gender, social class, nationality, ethnicity, and religion. Your task as a teacher will be to understand and connect with a room full of diverse students and use your expertise to help them develop the knowledge and skills they need to succeed in our society. To help organize our discussion of diversity, I'll be discussing about the group differences. Group differences. The ways in which one group of people might be different from another group. It includes the difference in culture, ethnicity, language, and socioeconomic status and gender. Keep in mind that individuals belong to several groups are the same. Remember also that the uniqueness of all human beings stems from the great variation that is found within any group of reference. In sum, the information presented in this section is not intended to help you predict particular student behavior or thinking, but rather to make you aware of group differences that may affect students' learning and performance. The challenge is to keep the information presented in this section in mind without assuming that all students from a particular group will display the typical or average patterns found by research. Cultures is a term that describes the knowledge, attitudes, values, and behaviors that characterize a group of people. Cultures are subject to change over time, especially when cultural groups come into contact with others. A major determinant of the culture in which people grow up is ethnicity, a term that refers to their common place of origin. Ethnic groups share a sense of interdependence due to the fact that they are comprised of people of the same race, national origin, or religious background. Race is the category of people who share biologically transmitted traits, such as skin color or hair texture. Today's classroom are likely to have a wide array of culture, ethnic, and racial diversity among students. Teachers need to understand that ethnicity cannot be judged on the basis of physical characteristics or birthplace alone, but rather by learning about the extent to which students participate in various cultural and ethnic groups' activities. Mainstream culture. Students matching this cultural background will be those who adapt easily to the classroom environment. The larger the difference between students' home culture and the mainstream culture, the more likely they will experience some type of culture shock, a term used to describe the anxiety and confusion felt when people have to operate within an entirely different cultural or social environment. Although this is understandable, it may lead teachers to unfairly judge students' cultural practices as least desirable or inferior. The next section describes some examples of cultural diversity to help you become more aware of the potential differences in your students' thinking and behavior. Keep in mind that there is significant variation within ethnic groups. One of the skills of a reflective practitioner is to carefully consider individual differences when interpreting students' verbal and nonverbal behavior and to avoid forming stereotypes about group. Language differences. Perhaps the most obvious cultural difference is students' language background. Respecting a student's first language is essential for building a solid classroom community. Even when English is spoken at home, students may speak dialects, which are special forms of English with distinctive pronunciations and grammatical structures. Dialects are usually the preferred way to communicate in everyday life of a cultural group and are considered to be part of group identity. Communication differences. Different cultural and ethnic groups have diverse verbal and non-verbal communication practices. Depending on the culture, interrupting rather than taking turns to speak may be an acceptable way to communicate. Cooperation versus competition differences. A competitive orientation can be especially detrimental to cultures that emphasize cooperation because most classrooms emphasize individual performance. This may lead to competition among students. In this cultures, children are taught the value of group rather than individual achievement. Consequently, students will be more likely to feel comfortable working with others. Time orientation. Typical classrooms also reflect these orientations by having a schedule with starting and ending times for each class project or activity, and establishing deadlines to turn in homework, papers, and other assignments. Family and worldviews. Although most cultures value school achievement highly and parents encourage their children to do well at school, for some cultural groups, family needs may take precedence over academic needs. Finally, students may not only show differences in their behaviors, but will have different beliefs and assumptions about the world, for instance, depending on their culture. Approaches to teaching in a culturally diverse classroom. During that time, students were described as disadvantaged or handicapped, and a cultural deficit model was used to explain the achievement gap as a result of a home culture that failed to prepare them to succeed academically. Cultural deficit model was used to explain the achievement gap as a result of a home culture that failed to prepare them to succeed academically. The cultural deficit model focuses on what students and their families do not have or cannot do. Teachers who take that approach are likely to interact differently with diverse students. For instance, they may call on them less frequently during discussions, give them less time to construct responses to questions, identify and correct misbehaviors more frequently and more harshly, give them lower grades, engage in less informal talk, and fail to establish close relationship with their families. One approach that was born from the need to respond to the increasingly diversity of the student population and the need to offer equal opportunity to all students is multicultural education. So multicultural education is not a specific educational program, but rather a wide variety of programs and practices related to educational equity, women, ethnic groups, language minorities, low-income groups, and people with disabilities. The ultimate goal of this approach is to help students develop the knowledge, attitudes, and skills needed to function within their culture, other cultures, and the global community. This is the diagram showing the multicultural education. There are 5 dimensions. First is the content integration. Content integration deals with the extent to which teachers use examples and content from a variety of cultures in their teaching. Knowledge construction. Teachers need to help students understand, investigate, and determine how the implicit cultural assumptions, frames of reference, perspectives, and bias within a discipline influence the ways in which knowledge is constructed. Prejudice reduction. This dimension focuses on the characteristic of students' racial attitudes and how they can be modified by teaching methods and materials. And equity pedagogy. An equity pedagogy exists when teachers modify their teaching in ways that will facilitate the academic achievement of students from diverse racial, cultural, gender, and social class groups. And 5. An empowering school culture, grouping, and labeling practices. Sports participation, disproportionality in achievement, and the interaction of the staff and the students across ethnic and racial lines must be examined to create a school culture that empowers students from diverse racial, ethnic, and gender groups. Effective multicultural educators strive to know their students through interaction and exploration, examine their own attitudes and beliefs about cultural diversity. There are different fields in diversity which I will discuss further. First is the language diversity. Until 1979, 9% students in the United States were from families whose primary language was other than English, also known as language minority students. By 2004, the percentage of language minorities had risen to 19%, and projections estimate that by 2026, 25% of students will come from families in which the primary home language is not English. The law gives states, districts, and schools flexibility to implement any language instruction program that is based on scientifically based research on teaching English to LEP children. These programs may be used both English and the student's home language and may include English proficient students to allow all students to become language proficient. Socioeconomic diversity. The term socioeconomic status is also used to categorize individuals based on their economic, educational, and occupational characteristics. Socioeconomic status is one of the most powerful factors influencing student achievement, often shadowing other group differences such as those stemming from ethnic background or gender. Health care. And children in poverty are more likely to be exposed to legal and illegal drugs before birth. That children in poverty were more likely to be uninsured than the population of uninsured children in 2006. These factors are also associated with impairments in higher cognitive development and with lower school achievement. Poor children do not receive medical or dental care regularly and suffer from untreated illnesses. Resources. Low socioeconomic status families have less access to high-quality preschool care for their children, and this can place them at a disadvantage in intellectual and social development, home support, and stimulation. Lack of emotional and cognitive stimulation at home can account for up to a half of low socioeconomic status children's academic disadvantages. Highest socioeconomic status parents are on average more involved in their children's school activities than lower socioeconomic status parents. Teacher expectations. In low-income neighborhoods, middle socioeconomic status teachers are likely to have low expectations for these learners and fail to provide sufficient stimulation to promote the development of high-order thinking skills. Gender and sex diversity. In this section, we discuss what is known about learning differences between males and females. Sex differences are almost always immediately obvious and controlled by nature. Gender differences instead are psychologically and socially controlled differences related to how individuals express their biological sex in their behavior. Gender bias occurs when a person has unjustified views of female versus male competencies, favoring one gender over the other. Nature versus nurture. There is much debate about the extent to which biological differences and gender socialization affect people's behavior. There are physical characteristics such as size and growth rate that can be explained by genetics. The case for nurture is supported by cross-cultural research which shows that all societies engage in gender socialization, teaching the behavior and attitudes considered appropriate for a given sex. All cultures have gender specification. Gender differences in the classroom. The strong evidence in favor of both nature and nurture as sources of gender differences has led most experts to conclude that they are the result of the interaction between genetics and the environment. Emotions and behavior. In general, girls are more sociable and trusting but have lower assertiveness and self-esteem than boys of their same background and age. Girls are also report more intense emotion than boys, yet females are better able to self-regulate their emotions and behavior than males. Males are also less likely to read for pleasure, do homework, take college preparatory classes, and complete high school than females, and more likely to skip class, hold part-time jobs out of school, and drop out of school than females. Physical performance. From a very young age, boys are more active than girls. Therefore, in the classroom, boys have a greater tendency to not pay attention, move around the room, and pose discipline problems. Technology use. According to a national survey of kindergarten through 6th grade students, males and females reported having equal access to computers at home and school. Gender differences, however, exist for the ways in which computers are used. Cognitive abilities. On average, females scores higher than males on tests of verbal abilities such as those assessing cognitive abilities. On average, females score higher than males on tests of verbal abilities, such as those assessing reading, vocabulary, spelling, grammar, and comprehension. In contrast, on average, males score higher than females on tests of visuospatial abilities such as tasks where they are required to mentally rotate objects, judge the velocity of moving objects, track movement through three-dimensional space, and aim at moving stationary target. Achievement. In math achievement, the picture is not so clear. Males tend to outperform females on standardized achievement tests, but girls tend to get higher math grades at school than boys. Therefore, teachers should not have different expectations for girls and boys for different subject areas. So how gender bias affects students? The general agreement amongst experts is that gender differences in achievement are the result of the gender bias in the home and school environments. In conclusion, the differential treatment of boys and girls at home and in the classroom can have a strong impact on students' identity and academic development. As a future teacher, you will need to understand and connect with a room full of diverse students. You can use your expertise to help them develop the knowledge and skills that they need to succeed.